A very warm welcome to everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Within the Frame. Coming to you live from Seoul, I'm Han Da-eun. It's now official. The Korea-Japan-China Trilateral Summit will be held in Seoul next Monday in what will be the first three-way meeting among the three Asian neighbors in more than 4 years. The annual summit has been stalled in the past few years due to a combination of the COVID-19 restrictions, historical feuds between Korea and Japan, and soured Seoul-Beijing relations amid the Yoon administration's pro-American foreign policy. But putting thorny issues aside, President Yoon Suk-yeol, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, and Chinese Premier Li Qiang are expected to resume talks focusing primarily on deepening economic cooperation and other areas of mutual interest. For a sneak peek into what we can expect from the highly anticipated summit, we have Kim Jae-chun, Dean and Professor at Sogang Graduate School of International Studies, joining us virtually. It's great to have you with us.
It's good to be here.
Also with us this evening is Mason Ritchie, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Always great to see you.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
All right, let's start off with you, Professor Kim. This will mark the first Korea-Japan-China Trilateral Summit in more than 4 years, as I mentioned at the top. First, tell us about the significance.
Three countries are finally holding this much-awaited summit. So that in and of itself is very significant. This trilateral summit has been suspended for about 4.5 years, as you said, mainly because of COVID pandemic, but also there was some unfortunate history issues that got in the way. And more importantly, so-called new Cold War international order. This new Cold War makes the summit between three countries very difficult. Why is that? Because a new Cold War has brought about what I would call blockization of the international order. So on the one hand, we have a group of liberal countries that try to preserve and strengthen the existing rule-based order, rules-based liberal international order. On the other hand, we have a block of revisionist countries, revisionist countries that want to sort of rewrite or revise the existing international order to their liking. And we all know that South Korea and Japan belong to the bloc of liberal countries, whereas China is de facto leader of the bloc of revisionist countries. And recently, South Korea and Japan strengthened the strategic ties with the United States, but China is having strategic competition with the United States, which makes trilateral cooperation between three countries very difficult. That said, I think three countries also understand that there are issues they can cooperate on, although their strategic stance has become quite divergent. That's why they are holding this summit, and that I think is the most significant aspect of the summit. And to South Korea, Korea-US-Japan relation is very important. Korea-China bilateral relation is also important as well. So this Trilateral Summit, I think, is going to be a very important venue for South Korea to enhance cooperation with China.
Well, this can be a turning point for the three neighbors to resume and normalize the trilateral cooperation system, right? And as you pointed out, that itself holds significance. And this could, of course, be added to the long list of President Yoon's major diplomatic achievements. And staying with you, Dr. Kim, economic cooperation among the three countries is expected to take center stage during this round of bilateral and trilateral summits. Do you expect an expansion of free trade agreements as well as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, better known as RCEP?
Well, it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell what sort of outcomes would come out with regard to the free trade principles and also regional trade agreements such as RCEP and also CPTPP, because China is having a trade war with the United States, and basically South Korea and Japan are on the side of the United States. We can't deny that, but you'll have to understand that it's not like South Korea and the U.S. are seeing eye to eye on everything, particularly on issues related to trade. Likewise, Japan and the U.S. aren't really on the same page as far as trade is concerned. True that South Korea and Japan endorsed the U.S. supply chain resilience policy, but the U.S. supply chain resilience policy doesn't necessarily mean complete decoupling with China's economy. It's more of de-risking, so the saying goes. So decoupling is taking place only in strategic industries. In fact, trade volume between the U.S. and China hit record high last year, which means that South Korea and Japan can also maintain proper trade relations with China. Although it's true that the international trade environment has become very unfavorable. So I cautiously anticipate that some positive statements would come out with regard to free trade principles and supply chain cooperation between three countries.
So they have their differences in their approach to advanced technology, especially in the semiconductor sector, but will likely focus on areas where they can draw mutual benefits. According to various reports, a joint declaration is expected to be adopted after the summit, and it'll likely focus on expanding free trade. But the details still remain murky, as you pointed out. Now, Professor Ritchie, nonetheless, the worsening supply chain risks due to intensifying U.S.-China competition remains a big hurdle for the world economy. How would the three countries address this thorny issue?
Well, at least in the context of the summit, we're going to get statements of economic interdependence. We're going to hear about the benefits of trade between and among these three countries. They will reiterate, whatever good economic news there is, and as we just heard, possibly broach the idea of deepening trade relations through, perhaps the development of, greater trade agreements among the three. We'll probably hear something about green economic development, and how Japan, South Korea, and China are all important in terms of helping their countries, but also the world, become greener in their economic development. We'll hear about the importance of people-to-people economic exchange. But at the end of the day, trade divergence is nonetheless the undertone. As we just heard, the U.S. is leading on export controls for sensitive, especially militarily sensitive product classes and dual-use items, notably semiconductors. Also, the United States has just put a lot of tariffs, or is in the process of putting a lot of tariffs on products from China. South Korea and Japan, for their part, as we just heard, are more or less on the side of the U.S. In this case. Not exactly supporting everything, obviously, but cautiously on the side of the United States. And of course, South Korea and Japan themselves have a declining trade weight with China. Last month, South Korea, for the first time, had greater total two-way trade with the U.S. than with China. And that's been the case with Japan for a while too. And so we see, South Korea and Japan, decreasing somewhat their trade relationship with China and increasing it with the U.S. South Korea and Japan are, of course, also looking for supply chain diversity, both vis-a-vis China through de-risking, but also more globally. They don't want to become over-reliant on any one country or even two countries. And then for China's part, China has its own Made in China 2025 policy, which it's aiming towards, which is, in practice, a way of gaining greater greater economic autonomy, and this is supported by what it's sometimes called a dual circulation model, where certain strategic items are being increasingly produced within China, and so in this sense, also China is trying to become more economically independent.
It'll be quite interesting to see if the summit will have an impact on the decreasing trade volume. Exports to China from Korea and Japan. And staying with you, Dr. Ritchie, the U.S. deployed 2 B-1B strategic bombers to a U.S. airbase in Guam on Thursday, saying they've returned to train with allies to enhance readiness and reinforce the rules-based international order in the Pacific, a term that China does not particularly like. Why do you think the U.S. military made the move right before the Trilateral summit, and how would China react?
The U.S. Indo-PACOM is calling this assignment one in support of a routine bomber task force deployment. I'm personally not privy to the decisions of Indo-PACOM about which bombers they're going to deploy for training missions, when and where. It's entirely possible that this was planned in advance, and this happens to be a coincidence. In fact, at least in terms of the Trilateral Summit, I think that's the case. But I would say not only does this B-1B bomber deployment come right before the Trilateral Summit, but it also, as China has decided to hold military drills around Taiwan to quote unquote punish it after the inauguration of its new leader, Lai Ching-te. And so I don't think that that's necessarily coincidental. I think one of the interesting questions, of course, will be to what extent will these bomber missions here and training with allies include South Korea and Japan. And again, I don't have any privy information regarding that, but it's entirely possible, as it has happened in the past. And certainly that's something that China will take note of.
And we'll talk more about Taiwan as we move on. But before that, Professor Kim, the summit comes just weeks after China and Russia jointly urged the U.S. to stop military intimidation against North Korea. Although the North Korea issue has been excluded from the official agenda of the Trilateral Summit, President Yoon is expected to touch upon North Korea during his one-on-one talks with Lee and Kishida. Would Korea be able to induce China's bigger role in taming North Korea?
I don't think so. I don't think it's likely. I mean, China is not going to agree on putting any kind of pressure on North Korea. As you indicated, China's position is basically, hey, let's not intimidate North Korea anymore. If you intimidate North Korea, we will not tolerate. So it's unlikely for China to agree to say, yeah, we'll play a bigger role on issues related to North Korea. I think China's position toward North Korea now is just to let them be, just to let them be. As I said, it's that blockization thing. In this new Cold War era, in this era of blockization, North Korea's strategic value to China looms larger than ever, because North Korea is a very important member of that bloc of revisionist countries. So say that if North Korea conducts another nuclear weapons test, sure, it can raise some eyebrows in Beijing, because Beijing still wants stability on the Korean Peninsula, I think. But China would never, ever abandon North Korea, because North Korea now is strategically very, very important. So the best that can come out about North Korea issues maybe something like 3 countries agree on nuclear-free Korean Peninsula, or denuclearization will have to come in peaceful manner, in diplomatic manner. Realistically, we can't really expect anything more from China.
The government, when asked about this, acknowledged that North Korea's nuclear issue is a topic that's hard to reach an agreement in a short period of time, so expectations are certainly not high on that front. Professor Ritchie, Taiwan's new president, Lai Ching-te, was sworn in on Monday, and China has summoned South Korean and Japanese diplomats in apparent protest to the 2 neighbors attending Lai Ching-te's inauguration ceremony. Would China raise its voice about this during the summit?
So one never knows how dyspeptic China is going to be in these meetings. Sometimes they surprise you, by being more assertive than one might think, given the context. But the concept for the agenda of this, trilateral meeting really seems to be highlighting areas of mutual cooperation and mutual interest, and so that includes people to people. exchanges, health, some science and technology cooperation, disaster response, economics and trade, as we've already talked about. North Korea, as you just mentioned, is not being prioritized, although there may be something in there about abductees, perhaps making it into the resolution, or at least somehow that might be brought up in one way or another in the meetings. But security in general isn't being prioritized because it's contentious. And in many respects, the point of this meeting is simply for all three countries' leaders to be able to say that they can stand to be with each other in the same room long enough to talk about some important issues. So the expectations are low. And so if security is not being prioritized and expectations are low, Taiwan is probably not something that's going to be welcome on the agenda. China, I'm sure, will find a way, in one form or another, to get its message on Taiwan across to Yoon and Kishida, who themselves will reiterate their one China policy. So I don't really expect that to be a problem, but you're certainly not going to make any big progress on that issue either.
Now, a Chinese media outlet, Huanqiu Shibao, published an op-ed saying that the summit will be a test for the Yoon administration to correct its China policy. What's your outlook, Professor Ritchie, on post-summit Seoul-Beijing relations, and do you anticipate President Xi Jinping to visit Seoul in the near future?
So that statement's absurd, and they know it's absurd, and we know it's absurd. The summit expectations are low, as I mentioned, and that's because there are real points of disagreement between China and South Korea and Japan, and Taiwan is one of those. China insists on what it calls the one China principle, and so when it says that South Korea needs to correct its approach to Taiwan and China, what it means is ultimately it wants South Korea to adopt what it calls the one China principle, which acknowledges China's sovereignty over Taiwan. South Korea and Japan hold, what the United States and Europe and many other countries refer to as a one China policy that forgoes a position on the question of sovereignty of Taiwan, and it says that this is something that's to be worked out between the Taiwanese and the Chinese. So I don't expect a change from South Korea in this regard. As for Xi Jinping, we had the foreign ministers, trilateral foreign ministers meeting last month, and that was sort of the first stepping stone, I guess, of trying to mend trilateral relations, or at least advance them in some way. And now we're getting to step two, and that's the summit among the leaders. And if the summit goes well, you could imagine that that is a condition, perhaps a necessary condition, for Xi Jinping at some point to come to South Korea. But it's not a sufficient condition. There's a lot to overcome in the South Korea-China relationship in order for Xi Jinping to come here, not least of which is the THAAD issue, which still remains. And so, I have a difficult time imagining that Xi Jinping would come to South Korea, even if this meeting goes well, unless things warm up considerably between South Korea and China, and they manage to make some progress on some thorny issues, which, frankly speaking, Yoon doesn't seem inclined to do, whether that be over Taiwan or whether that be over military cooperation with the U.S. in the context of the alliance, or whether that be on the THAAD issue, or whether that be on economic security issues. So I frankly don't see that happening in the near future. I could be wrong. That seems like at best something for the mid to long term.
So President Xi's visit to Seoul is unlikely, at least for the time being. Now, Professor Kim, establishing a framework to hold the Trilateral Summit on a regular basis is another focal point. While experts agree that China is seeking to break its isolation on the global stage through the three-way cooperation, what are your prospects on this?
Well, establishing a framework to hold the summit on a regular basis, I mean, it shouldn't be too difficult, I think, because we already have this framework to hold the trilateral summit on a regular basis, on yearly basis, because the Trilateral Summit was held annually from 2008 until 2012, if my memory serves me correct. And for the reference, 2008 was the year when the summit was inaugurated. So from the inception, we held the summit for 5 years in a row. And then some difficult issues got in the way, history issues got in the way, and the summit took place irregularly. But it's important to remember that we have a precedent of holding the summit 5 years in a row. So I don't think it's going to be too difficult to say that, at least in principle, at least in theory, 3 countries would hold the Trilateral Summit on regular basis from now on annual basis. But we'll have to wait and see, I guess.
And just very quickly before we let you go, Dr. Kim, the Naver-Yahoo line feud has emerged as a fresh source of diplomatic conflict between Korea and Japan. Would this issue be discussed, and would South Korea make a stronger voice as demanded by the Korean people?
I don't know for sure, but it seems to me that South Korean government is now under increasing pressure because of the growing public anger due to this, Yahoo line scandal. I don't know whether scandal is the right word there, but after the lopsided victory of the opposition parties in general election in last month, it seems to me that Yoon government's foreign policy initiatives would encounter domestic political backlashes. That, I think, includes Korea-Japan relations. Korea-Japan relations gained the momentum to restore normal relations, but still there are many more hurdles that both countries need to cross. Challenges would come mostly from within in both countries. I'm not sure whether Korea-Japan relations would endure domestic political changes. With regard to Yahoo line issue, I guess the real issue here is whether Japanese government intervened improperly, in which case South Korean government has no option but to address grievances. So during the Trilateral Summit, I think President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida would meet bilaterally. I hope that both leaders could somehow iron out the differences on this thorny issue.
Well, this issue will certainly keep popping up as we move forward, and we'll be sure to keep close tabs on it. Thank you, both of you, for your expertise and analysis. And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back with more same time next week. Have a great weekend.